Every now and then, Three Dog will hop on the radio to give us a public service announcement.
What's up, Wastelanders? This is Three Dog Bow Wow, and you're listening to GNR. That's Galaxy News Radio, in case you forgot. News time, children. There have been more and more sightings of raiders over by Evergreen Mills. Smart money's on them having some kind of camp out that way. Keep that in mind the next time you feel like nosing around that neighborhood.
So the raiders are hanging out in Evergreen Mills. Maybe it's time for this good karma character to pay them a little visit. Heading southeast of Megaton, we stumble upon a completely wrecked up train tunnel. We see a number of train cars derailed and tipped to the side, and then we see some super mutant gore bags crouching down and trying to be as quiet as possible. We don't see any super mutants, however, so standing on up, we can head over to one of these tipped over cars. We see a number of skeletons lying around. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 skeletons right outside this car. Inside, we see a curious contraption. There appears to be a teddy bear inside a cart cage. Well, I'm sure Marie would love this, so opening up the cage, the teddy bear freaks out. We hear a roar. Where is this coming from? And then we see it. A super mutant behemoth charges from the nearby hillside. As he meanders over, we can take out our Gauss rifle and take advantage of its knockback effect to keep him pinned. In this way, we can whittle him down and keep him stationary until he's dead. These behemoths are well worth the effort. We walk away with an assortment of weapons, over 100 bottle caps, and a whole bunch of thrown explosives, even a mini nuke and some psycho. Back down on the tracks, we can follow them west in search of Evergreen Mills. Eventually, the tracks go between two rocky outcroppings on either side. As we continue forward, we see another car derailed and a platform with a spotlight on it. Looks like this is the entrance to some sort of raider warren. We can take out the raider here, but I don't like the idea of following this track any further. The last thing I want to do is become a target for raiders sniping at me from elevated platforms. So instead, we're going to climb up one of these rocky outcroppings. Let's go up the western one first. Creeping along, we can equip our Chinese stealth armor and our shady hat until at last the rocky outcropping ends and we find ourselves overlooking an abandoned pre-war mill that has now become a raider city. We see raiders all over the place, walking along elevated platforms, milling around in the back, and in the middle of this complex, what is that? It looks like a pen. And is that another super mutant behemoth inside? Sure enough, this is one big super mutant pen. There's a gate, and outside the gate is a switch and a generator. We also find slave cages. These raiders are slavers, and they're holding 3 or 4 slaves here before processing. Well, I wanted to try something, but I can't do it from this position. So retracing our steps, we can head back to the entrance and climb the hill to the east to arrive on the other side of this rocky valley. From here, we can snipe a few of the guards as we creep forward. With most of these snipers gone, I wanted to see if from here I could see that switch next to the pen. Sure enough, from the eastern hillside, we get a clear shot of the switch. Taking a shot.
Over here.
Nothing really seems to happen. All I do is alert my enemies. But we can try something else. Creeping forward just a little bit until the generator is visible. Bingo! We destroy the generator, disconnecting the electric fence. The super mutant behemoth breaks free and attracts the attention of all of the raiders. We can use this opportunity to pick them off one by one. Looks like we got them all. The behemoth is walking away with no one else to fight. Now that he's outlived his usefulness, we can destroy the super mutant behemoth. Now that the place is clear, we can head on in, but I didn't want to drop to my death, so heading back to the entrance, we can go down the train tracks. And we quickly see that the raiders have booby-trapped it. We find frag mines littering the ground. After disabling all the mines, we can go up a ramp to the northwest. This is going to give us a good view of the entire complex. The ramp encircles the slave pen and then splits. Heading to the southeast first, we can loot the body of one of the raider guards we killed who was manning this spotlight. And of course, we find a finger on these guys if we have the Lawbringer perk. From here, we get our best lay of the land. We see a shack to the south, a big pre-war building to the southwest, another shack to the west, and then a shack on this hillside to the northwest. We'll head there first because it looks like this path brings us right there. Approaching the door, we learn that this is the guardhouse. Inside, however, we don't find any enemies. Instead, we find 3 ammo boxes to the northwest, and then some minor junk on a shelf. Inside the wooden box at the top, we find a stash of turpentine and a rat-away. To the southwest, we find a locker next to a single bed, and inside, we find the Evergreen Mills slave pen key. Looks like we can unlock the slave pen with this. At the foot of the bed, we find some shotgun shells sitting on top of an empty box, and that's about it for the guardhouse. Now, before we go down to unlock the slave pen, I want to make sure that we've really killed all of the raiders out here. So going behind the shack to go around, we see a tripwire. What is this connected to? And then we see it, a grenade bouquet. After disarming the traps, we can continue to the southwest. Behind the mill, we see campfires rising from the rickety shacks. Scaling the rocks behind the mill, we see that the mill itself is comprised of a couple of buildings connected by big floating tubes. We see a water tower near the back, and it has some text on it. McLean? McLean is the name of a real-world town in Northern Virginia. So I suppose this means that we are exploring the pre-war ruins of McLean. We see that raiders sometimes camp out on these floating pods to relax. We see graffiti, bloody handprints, and a bunch of whiskey bottles. Continuing around, it looks like we missed one. But only one. The super mutant behemoth sure did a good job. We're now on the southwestern side of Evergreen Mills. This leads to the southern shack. And as soon as we enter...
Found you. What's the matter, huh? Can't stand the sight of your own blood?
It was a pretty well-armed enemy. Thankfully, I got him before he could turn on the fire. On the northern side of the door, we find an ammo container on the ground next to a counter. The countertop has a bunch of dishes and silverware. The fridge is filled with alcohol, and then in this room we find just more scrap. Heading on into the bedroom. To the right, we see a shelf. In the bottom box, we find some mentats, and in the box right above it, we find some Rad-X. We can find more flamer fuel in the cabinet, and then some dirty water and pre-war money in some boxes on the shelves to the south. On top of these shelves are 2 ammo crates with missiles and frag mines inside, and then on the other one are 2 first aid boxes, right next to a copy of U.S. Army 30 handy flamethrower recipes. This guy really loved his flamethrowers. And also missile launchers, from all appearances. We find one lying on this huge double bed. There's a wall-mounted shelf to the north covered in skulls, but here we do find a pot, and inside the pot is this guy's jet stash. With the southern shack explored, we can head outside and go down the hill to loot that raider we killed recently. Looks like the raiders used a variety of scrap metal to build lean-tos and other minor shelters over here. Heading north down the tracks, we find a tripwire between one of the cars and another shack. This was connected to a grenade bouquet. Inside, we find a bunch of typical raider decorations like hanging bodies. To the southeast, we find a shelf with a mine box and 2 first aid kits. We can now walk down a tight alleyway between a rail car and a shack that we can't enter to finally loot that super mutant behemoth body. But this guy only has 62 caps on his inventory. It's likely he was looted by the raiders when he was captured. And with that, we've made a big circle of the entire perimeter of Evergreen Mills. Now it's time to go a little deeper. We'll start by heading to the west. There's not much loot in the little lean-to shacks out here, but behind them, we find an entrance to the northern shack. And as soon as we enter...
Henry Eaton, and you're listening to Enclave Radio.
Oh, are you a slave or... Oh, she was a raider in sexy lingerie. Okay, I think we get the idea what these two raiders were up to. Now that they're dead, we can head back downstairs and turn off Enclave Radio. I always find it weird that raiders are always listening to patriotic Enclave Radio. There is a tidy stash of loot here, an ammo box on the ground to the southwest, next to a first aid kit on a table. There's another ammo box on the ground to the southeast on the other side of a locker. And then behind the stairs, we find 3 more ammo boxes. Heading out from behind the stairs, we see a Lone Wanderer motorcycle. There's a hallway to the east. We see shotgun shells on top of some filing cabinets. And then from this hallway, there's a small room to the south. Here we find a workbench, and as we typically find on workbenches, a bottle cap mine. Looks like these raiders were performing amateur surgery. Either that or they delight in torturing people. We find a bloody skull on this table. With the downstairs explored, we can head upstairs and loot the fingers off of the corpses of the raiders we killed to turn in for the bounty. Strange, however, we find fingers in ash piles. Odd that we'll vaporize an entire body and turn it to ash except for one index finger sticking out. The couple were enjoying a nice big double bed when we interrupted them. To the south, we find some 10mm ammunition on a shelf, and in a wooden box, hidden beneath a small ruined book, is 1 Mentats. Here we also find Jet on the shelf next to a first aid box. Heading out and turning north, we can go down a hallway. This was their kitchen. Lots of full bottles of whiskey all over the floor, and then some minor food and Nuka-Cola in the fridge. Heading outside and turning east, we can go up the tracks towards the slave pen. We see the slaves still milling about. Thankfully, none of them died during the battle. Opening the first gate, we see that there was no slave in this pen. Instead, we find the slaves in the second pen, which we can open up with the key we found in the guardhouse. These guys don't say much. They don't thank us or anything. They just run on out. With the perimeter fully explored, we're going to head towards the middle and loot the bodies of the raiders that died to the super mutant behemoth. They just litter the ground over here. Heading towards the behemoth pen, we see the wreckage of the generator we blew up. We can flip the electrical switch, but since the generator's down, nothing happens. The inside of the behemoth pen is disgusting. The ground is stained dark red. We find human torsos, bones, partial skeletons, and gore all over the place. These raiders were feeding this behemoth slaves. What did they even need the behemoth for? Perhaps they used the behemoth as leverage to intimidate and threaten the slaves to keep them compliant. Heading out into the southwest towards the mill, we find the slaves we released.
Hey, where could we go even if we did escape? We'd just die in the wasteland. Why bother?
Come on, guys, you could be a little more grateful. It's not even worth it to release them. They just hang around here. The main building to this compound is behind a large gate, which is open. Here we see a large courtyard filled with pre-war cars. Looking up, we see a big sign, Evergreen Mill. It's interesting to note that the pre-war sign says Evergreen Mill, but the key we found and 3 Dog refer to it as Evergreen Mills. Evergreen Mills sounds better, so I'll just go ahead and refer to it as that. There's nothing of interest outside, so to continue, we can open the door to the west to the Evergreen Mills Foundry. With the raiders gone, we can explore this area where we find ourselves. We're in some sort of vaulted chamber. There's a stairway encircling the perimeter of this chamber, leading up to other floating pods. Here on the ground level, we find a couple of empty dumpsters. One has bloody handprints on top with a corpse inside. We can go up a small stairway to a pod to the south. Turning a corner to the north, we find a broken terminal. We can activate it, but it says no input device recognized. Reconnect keyboard. In a pot on a nearby shelf is one mentat. Heading back into the main chamber, we see that one of the raiders we killed is leaning against a big safe. On a shelf near to the safe is a box with one buff out inside. The safe is locked with an average lock. Unlocking it, we find a small amount of caps and pre-war money. There's a gun cabinet to the south with an assault rifle and some ammo inside. At the bottom of a shelf to the northeast is a box filled with billiard balls, and that's all we find in this floating pod, so heading out, we can turn east towards the stairs. There's a toolbox and some minor containers on the ground against the wall. Of note, we find a stash of 42 railway spikes in one. There's a Nuka-Cola machine against the wall to the north, and then heading up the nearby stairs, we see a bar to the east. Behind the bar are 2 locked ammo containers and a locked first aid kit in the right shelf, an unlocked ammo container and an unlocked first aid kit on the left shelf, and then a cabinet with some bobby pins and booze inside. There's a wall-mounted easy locked safe behind the counter. Inside we find bottle caps and pre-war money. We find 2 med-X on a plate next to an 8-ball, and when done we can continue north up the stairs. But before we can climb up, we see a door to the right to the Evergreen Mills Bazaar. A raider bazaar, I can only imagine what that's going to look like. As we prepare for anything, we open the door to appear in a big rec room. No raiders, no carnival, no merchants. Okay, this was not what I was expecting. There's a barrel on fire to the north. We find a fire extinguisher in a box with some buff out. We see that the floor of this room has collapsed, creating a rubble ramp leading down to a big cave. Inside the cave, we see the bazaar we were expecting. And 3 raiders. Let's hope I don't miss this first shot. Oh!
You like that? That's over.
On the ground floor, there's a sandy path that leads to a dead end, so the only way forward is to go up a ramp to the southeast. This splits to the left or right. Going right, we can loot the raider bartender and then turn off his Enclave radio. There's a first aid kit on the shelf behind the bar, next to 5 .32 caliber rounds and a pistol. We find common food items in the 2 refrigerators, a Nuka-Cola Quantum in the wooden box on the top of the shelf, and then it looks like there's a skull in this pot, but I couldn't dislodge it. Continuing east up the ramp, we see the raiders have erected some sort of dice chandelier. This may be a marketplace that raiders all over the Capital Wasteland know about to come and peddle their stolen goods. At the top of this ramp, we find a cafeteria level with tables and chairs strewn with ashtrays and empty bottles. At the back of this level is a ramp up to another eating area. We see that we can continue northwest across some ramps to other platforms. Continuing forward, we find a billiard table, and behind it, a pathway through a cave hole to the east. At the bottom, we find the marketplace, but it still has some shoppers.
Found you.
One raider runs out, and he doesn't attack. Chasing after him, we learn that his name is Smiling Jack.
Hey, good to see you again. What do you need?
He seems to treat us as any other raider, despite the fact we killed his clientele. We can ask him to repair our gear.
Sure thing. Just be quick about it before someone sees.
Interesting response. Sadly, his repair skill is only 15. We can ask him what he has for sale.
Fresh out of the hands of some mark. Take a look.
And as we expect, he clearly admits that he's selling stolen goods. He has a small selection of weapons, including 1 missile launcher, but a decent selection of ammunition, making him a pretty valuable merchant for those who quickly run out of ammo. He heads back to the marketplace and promptly ignores us. Oh well, we can get to looting. There's a first aid box on one counter. Behind the other, we see 2 teddy bears in a bucket at the bottom of this shelf. In a pot directly above this, we find a pulse grenade. Heading north, we see a path leading off to the northeast. It's a tiny little workshop with another bottle cap mine on top. It's a little tricky to wedge on through, but if we can leap over this workbench to loot the shelf behind. And it's here where we find the barter bobblehead. You found a Vault-Tec limited edition bobblehead. The inscription on the base reads, "Never forget to walk away with more than you've brought. Your barter skill has been permanently increased by 10. Behind the counter, we find an average locked wall-mounted safe. Inside, a small stash of caps. When done, we can head up the path back to the primary marketplace. On the shelf behind the northern counter, we see 2 boxes. In one, we find a Rad-X. In the other, we find 1 Mentat.
Hey, what'd I tell you about looking at me like that? Are you in the mood for a busted mouth or something?
Strong words coming from a guy who ran from me in fear just a moment before. Next to him is Smiling Jack's locker, but we can't open or pick this. It requires Smiling Jack's key. Behind the west counter, we find 1 Rad-X on a shelf, and inside the hard-locked ammo box on the bottom, we find some microfusion cells.
¿Qué pasa?
¿Qué pasa? Now, this guy may be neutral, but he is a raider. God knows how many people these raiders have killed or enslaved, and this guy is reaping the rewards, selling their goods to other raiders for caps. I'm curious to see if he has anything interesting on his inventory. Sneaking up behind him, we can try to pickpocket him. But I don't know whether because I'm experiencing some bug or if my pickpocketing skill is so low, but all we find are shotgun shells. But where there are shells, there should be a shotgun. Since this is a raider, we get no karma penalty for killing him.
Got your back.
It doesn't count as murder. On his body, we find Smiling Jack vendor key and the terrible shotgun. When I got this shotgun, it was broken. Perhaps that's why we didn't find it when we tried to pickpocket it. But after we repair it back at our Megaton house, we discover that it's one of the most powerful shotguns in the entire game. It has the second highest raw damage of any other gun in the small guns category, dealing 80 damage, allowing 1.5 shots per second, bringing its DPS up to 120. It does way more critical damage than a combat shotgun. A combat shotgun does 27 critical damage, but the terrible shotgun does 40. This damage is calculated per pellet, which means that if all 9 pellets land a critical hit on the target, which can be done, especially if executing a sneak attack critical, this weapon will do 360 damage. Things just start getting crazy when you add perks to this. If you have the better criticals perk, damage can rise to 540, and when you consider the 80 base power of the weapon, which we then double due to a sneak attack, this weapon will do a whopping 880 damage or 1,240 with the better criticals perk, which brings it close to the damage dealt by the Fat Man. If, in fact, we do a sneak critical headshot against an enemy using this weapon with the better criticals perk, this weapon will do even more damage than a Fat Man. The only drawback to this gun is that it has double the spread of a combat shotgun. Combat shotguns have a spread of 3, but this one has a spread of 6. Since the damage of this gun is spread between all 6 pellets within each shell, to benefit from its high damage, each pellet has to hit, which means that this weapon is best used in close quarters. It's not good for mid to long range. Turning around and heading out of this marketplace, we can pass this billiard table where we find another one to the right. This one overlooks a ledge to the cave floor below. Instead of falling, we can go across a ramp to the platform to the southwest when we get spotted by a raider. With this raider dead, we can loot the shelf in front of us. We just find scrap and minor loot. Continuing along, we suddenly realize where we are. These poles are surrounded by red lights. These are stripper poles. On the ground, we find a bunch of bottle caps that the admiring raiders threw at the strippers. But then we see something really horrible. Toys? We find blocks and toy cars and 2 teddy bears. Why were there children's toys around a stripper pole? Could it be, and I know this is absolutely awful, but could it be that this means that these raiders were kidnapping children, making them slaves, and then putting them on display like this? This may be one of the most horrible things I've seen in the Fallout universe so far. To the west, we see an entrance, bathed in red light. The red light is emanating from bulbs on mannequins. This can mean only one thing. On the other side of this hallway is a brothel. Heading up the ramp, we peek our head up to see if we can find any enemies. Oh!
Fresh blood.
Where? Found you.
Come on, boy.
Hey,
I'm still in
where?
there.
On the corpse of one raider, we find Madame's key. So she was the one in charge of this brothel. We can use the key to unlock the cash register on the nearby countertop. I wonder how long this brothel has been open for business. We can loot some Med-X and again use the key to unlock a wall-mounted safe where we find some ammunition caps and buff out. Unlocking the cell directly in front of us, we see more children's toys. A toy car in the bathtub, a bicycle on the ground, toy blocks on the bunk bed, and more bears. On one of the beds, we find a copy of Nikola Tesla and You. Heading out, we can loot some jet on a table, and then unlock 2 ammunition canisters in a freezer cabinet. Moving into the next bedroom, no toys. 2 beds, one with a radio nearby, but no toys. Turning around, we can explore the rooms on the opposite end. In one, we find a glowing red light and a big double bed. After looting some bottle caps from a footlocker and some right away on a nearby shelf, we see that the raider who was last here had taken off his or her Raider Blastmaster armor and laid it on a nearby gurney. There's some dirty water in a nearby tub and some buff out by a telephone. We also find Med-X on the bedside table. Could it be that these raiders were imprisoning slave children in the cell who were then chosen by raiders who came here and paid to use them, and then dragged against their will to this room with the chems and the red light and the double bed? Now, we don't find any slaves in here, let alone any slave children. And the one we find locked in the cell was a raider who attacked us, not a slave. So perhaps this brothel is not quite as dark as that. And yet, how do we explain all of the toys? After looting absolutely everything in the bazaar, we can retrace our steps and head back to the Mills Foundry. Now we can continue up the staircase to the west. And as we do, more raiders emerge.
Found you. Oh, where that came from.
As we creep up, we see a body below us across the way. Peering through our scope, we see a magazine lying nearby. I want to get that, but maybe we'll find a way down there as we continue exploring. At the very top of the catwalk, turning right, we find a raider bedroom. There are mattresses on the ground. We can loot a first aid kit to the north. Heading on turning right, we go through a floating pod to reach the other side of this catwalk, where we see a raider in the pod across the way. Goodness, Sharon, leave some for me. Before we go through the door, let's finish exploring up here. Turning around and peering down, we again see that body on the mattress next to that magazine, but no real way to get down. We may have to jump, but let's do that last as we leave. Continuing to the end of this catwalk, we pass graffiti on the walls to find one more floating pod. After looting a first aid kit on a table and some red X from a box on the shelf, we find another broken terminal. Bad data cannot read. Not exactly sure why Bethesda included all of these broken terminals, but that's the end of the catwalk. So turning around and then going left into that door, we go down a hallway where we see 2 paths, a room to the right and a door to the left. Going into the room to the right first, we see that it's empty. It's just blasting more Enclave radio. Turning this off, we can loot some electron charge packs and some microfusion cells on the desk, and inside the desk is the storage room key. In the cabinet to the left, we find some bobby pins and booze. And here we find another workbench. But instead of a bottle cap mine, we find some railway spikes and a nuka grenade. This is an exceedingly rare explosive. In a pot right next to the workbench is a stash of fragmentation grenades. And finally, we can loot an average locked wall safe at the foot of the bed. Inside, we can walk away with a small stash of caps. After looting some bottle caps near some cigarettes on a bedside table, we can grab some railway spikes at the bottom of a shelf as we're about to leave, and then head east to open the final door in this complex. This was locked, but we can open it with the storage room key we looted from the desk. Inside, we find a very easy locked wall safe with some bottle caps and pre-war money. On a shelf next to this is a first aid kit and an easy locked ammo box with flamer fuel. Inside the gun cabinet is a laser rifle and some microfusion cells. And then we find a big stash of chems: Jet, Mentats, Buffout, and Psycho on a shelf. But the big prize, of course, is a fat man lying on a nearby cabinet. If anything, we can use this to repair our experimental MIRV. Heading out, we have not yet found a way to get down to that platform where we saw that body. Looks like we've got to jump. Going down one level, we see that the lip of the pod below is a bit wider than this catwalk, which means we should be able to drop down, bingo, and land right on top of it. Near to this body is a copy of Duck and Cover. And we're not stuck. We find that we are low enough to the ground where we can just leap on down and then exit to the north the way that we came. And that is the full but dark story of Evergreen Mills. These raiders were slavers, and by clearing the compound, we put a stop to at least one part of the slave trade going on here in the Capital Wasteland. But of course, we have a lot more to do on that front. We have yet to tackle Paradise Falls. What are your thoughts on that dark scene we found inside the Bazaar? Could I possibly be misinterpreting all the toys and teddy bears we found by the stripper poles? All those blocks and cars we found on the bunk beds inside the only locked cell? Could there be a more innocent explanation, or is it really as horrible as I thought? Let me know in the comments section below. I publish a new Fallout video 6 days a week on a wide range of topics spanning all of the games. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss my next video, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook to keep up to date with all Oxhorn news. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning bright and early with a brand new video.